Thank you everyone for attending the National Farmers Union's webinar series, NF University. Our presenters today are Dr. David Burton, Dr. Hushton Block, and Dr. Andrew Vanderzag, and the topic is low-hanging fruit. What can farmers do to reduce emissions now? Dr. David Burton is a soil scientist and director of Dalhousie Center for Sustainable Soil Management. Over the past 30 years, Dr. Burton's research has examined the role of the soil environment in influencing the nature and extent of microbial metabolism. He focuses on the nitrogen cycle in the context of soil fertility and environmental impact. His current research involves the examination of the production and consumption of greenhouse gases in natural and agricultural landscapes, developing tools for the measurement of soil nitrogen supplies, the influence of climate on soil processes, and the assessments of soil health. This work aids in developing sustainable land management systems in a changing climate. Dr. Hushton Block is a beef production systems research scientist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. He's originally from Alberta. He has degrees from the University of Alberta, University of Saskatchewan, and University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Dr. Block joined AAFC's Lacombe Research and Development Center in 2014, where he applies his background in beef cattle nutrition and production to challenges facing the beef industry. Dr. Andrew Vanderzag completed his undergraduate degree at the University of Guelph and his PhD at Dalhousie University. Since 2011, he's worked as a research scientist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada at the Experimental Farm in Ottawa. His research focuses on greenhouse gas emissions measurement and mitigation in livestock production systems, which has involved on-farm research across Canada. Dr. Burton will go first, followed by Dr. Block, then Dr. Vanderzag. Go ahead, Dr. Burton.
Okay, thank you very much, Darren. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here and spend a bit of time talking to you about one of the subjects I'm most passionate about, and that's improving the efficiency of nitrogen management in agriculture. I'll start by sharing my slides. Okay, I'm assuming you can see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the role of soil management in a path to net zero. I think we're all being challenged, all sectors of the Canadian economy. In fact, the globe is being challenged to think about how do we actually get to net zero as a way of moderating our impact on climate and sustaining our world. From a Canadian agriculture perspective, that's a bit of a challenge in that we've moderated our greenhouse gas emissions. They're not going up as quickly as they once did, but they're not going down. So we have to think about some interventions where we can turn that trend around and start to reduce them, and eventually try to strive for a net zero type outcome. So I'm going to talk about some of the practices that I think can do that, and practices that are currently available. I'm going to focus on nitrogen. One of the challenges we've had with nitrogen is nitrous oxide emissions, in terms of that's the major greenhouse gas that's being produced from nitrogen fertilizer use, and agriculture is the major producer of nitrous oxide in Canada. And here I've indicated the trend in direct, in other words, the nitrous oxide that is immediately emitted from the soil, and indirect N2O emissions. Those are the N2O emissions that result from nitrogen that's lost from the system as nitrate or ammonia, but then eventually become nitrous oxide. And again, especially in terms of direct emissions, the trend is increasing. Where's that coming from? Well, there's a variety of sources of that potential nitrogen, those emissions. The most dominant one, though, is the use of nitrogen, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer in annual crop rotations. And so that's one of the ones we're trying to focus on in terms of how can we reduce these emissions. One of the challenges we face is the fact that as we have increased our yields and increased our growth potential, We've done that by applying a lot of nitrogen fertilizer. And in fact, we've actually reduced the efficiency with which we're using that nitrogen fertilizer. Uh, in the early part of this graph, there was relatively less synthetic nitrogen added, so we were using it more efficiently, but that also limited our yields. As we increased yield, we were using more and more synthetic fertilizer, but that means we're using it less and less efficiently. Also, and this is a graph from the NFU report that Darren championed and put together. This is costing us money. We're spending a lot of money and we're not keeping as much on farm as we should be. And so there's this concept that we're adding more and more inputs, but we're not necessarily getting as much as we should from that. One of the things that we've often sort of thought about in terms of nitrogen fertilizer, we often talk about insurance nitrogen. Being sure that we've added enough nitrogen, so if that next year is that really good year, we're not going to miss out. And that's part of the reason that's caused us to become less and less efficient in terms of our nitrogen management. And here's a little parable that I find really illustrates the point well. If you were a cattle rancher and you kept losing cattle out of the hole in your fence, would your decision be to buy more cattle or fix the hole in the fence? And what I'm going to talk about is how we can fix the hole in the fence in terms of nitrogen management, how we can reduce the leaks so that we can be more efficient using that nitrogen rather than simply just buying more nitrogen. And the good news is there's lots of things we can do right now to do that. And not only are those useful in terms of reducing nitrogen losses, they're also useful in increasing our profit. Okay, so we can, and there's three basic avenues that we can do this. We can adjust the rates of nitrogen we use, make sure we're using just the amount we require. We can reduce the leaks by using innovative techniques of applying that nitrogen. And we can also fully credit all the various nitrogen sources that are contributing to our system. And these three things combine to allow us to increase the efficiency of nitrogen use without sacrificing yield. And here's a bit more detail on those three things. Adjusting rates by making sure that we're actually applying the amount of nitrogen the crop needs, not focusing on target yields that we're not obtaining, but focusing on supplying the crop we're actually receiving on our farms. An economic analysis to ensure that we're focusing on most profitable nitrogen application rates rather than maximum yield, and ensuring that that's based on end response curves that are relevant to our region. In terms of reducing leaks, I'm going to talk about a 4R approach that uses things like enhanced efficiency fertilizers to increase the efficiency of nitrogen delivery. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about some research we've been doing in Atlantic Canada, but are extending to the entirety of Canada, where we're actually trying to quantify the magnitude of nitrogen mineralization so that can be more effectively represented in our nitrogen budgeting approach. One of the most critical decisions in terms of managing nitrogen on the farm is getting the rate right. And it's something we've not been doing a very good job of. Too often we've been focusing on nitrogen application rates to maximize yield. Unfortunately, maximizing yield doesn't always, in fact, it seldom maximizes our profit. And that extra bit of nitrogen we add doesn't pay for itself, and it also has the greatest environmental impact. So we really want to focus on making sure that we're only putting the nitrogen on that we actually need for the yields we're getting, not the yields we wish we were getting. So that goal should be to maximize profit and consider all sources of revenue. And I'll come back to that point in a moment. We have to also remember these N additions are supplemental. So we actually have to think about what other sources of nitrogen are already providing nitrogen to the crop. And that's where I'll come back to this concept of measuring nitrogen mineralization. And finally, we should apply that in a manner that maximizes efficiency. And that's where the enhanced efficiency fertilizers will come from. That point will arise. How do we know when we don't have enough nitrogen? Well, visually, we can see the crop is a bit pale. It isn't quite as dark a green as we'd like, although caution, dark green isn't necessarily necessary to produce most profitable yields. We can measure that greenness using spectral tools like NDVI and a drone or something like that. We can also do plant tissue testing to see how much nitrogen is in the plant. One of the challenges we have, though, is we have ways of saying when we haven't put enough nitrogen on, but we don't have very good ways of saying, did we put too much on? We're often not checking for that. And I think we've, over time, continually implying, using that concept of insurance nitrogen, we've tended to go start using rates that are higher than I think what we need. And one of the things we're advocating is that you should consider the use of a check strip where you use a 10% reduction of nitrogen rate in your system. Just go down the field with one strip at 10% reduced rate, see if it makes a difference. See if there's any real difference in yield, and look and do the economics in that, see what the profit was on that strip. The other thing you could do is you can measure nitrate that remains in the soil after harvest. How much was left over? Because we want to minimize that value. In prairie Canada, that nitrogen can be retained and will be provided to the next crop because of the nature of the winters in prairie Canada. But in eastern Canada and BC, almost all of that nitrogen is lost. And so we want to avoid that nitrate accumulation after the fall. The industry is, the fertilizer industry has introduced this concept of 4R management. And I think it's a really useful concept because it is built on sound scientific principles, and it focuses on using the right source of nitrogen at the right rate, putting it on at the right time in the right place. And so what I'm talking about builds upon that framework. In fact, I'm going to focus a little bit more on this right rate, where two of the key principles in 4R is to assess nutrient supply from all sources and assess plant demand and make sure we're only providing the nitrogen that the plant requires. Here's a graph from a recent meta-analysis that's looking at all the various management practices that can reduce N2O emissions. And I've highlighted in red the two that are most reliable and have the most dramatic reductions. Optimizing fertilizer rate, on average, resulted in about a 25% reduction in nitrous oxide emissions, and the use of one of a number of enhanced efficiency products, which reduce nitrous oxide emissions anywhere from about 25 to 50%. Now, this is focusing on nitrous oxide emissions, but it's also true for the overall efficiency of that nitrogen supply to the plant. So these products would also reduce nitrate leaching, ammonia loss if used properly, and therefore just increase the overall efficiency of nitrogen use within the system. Here, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the various kinds of enhanced efficiency fertilizers. The basic principle is we want to slow the transformation of nitrogen either to ammonium or to nitrate to reduce the potential for loss and delay the availability of nitrogen till the time where it's most likely to be taken up by the plant. We want to really synchronize nitrogen supply with plant nitrogen demand. Oftentimes, we want to put the nitrogen on at planting or early in the season when that's most convenient to get on the field, but the plant doesn't need it for 3 or 4 weeks later. So we want to use some means of delaying the availability of that nitrogen so that its potential for loss is decreased. The two major losses that we're worried about is ammonia loss, ammonia volatilization, and that results from the hydrolysis of urea, allowing ammonium to accumulate in an alkaline environment, and it can be volatilized. Two approaches to reducing that is we can coat that urea with a polymer that slows the water infiltration and allows that urea to only slowly be solubilized and therefore only slowly hydrolyzed. Alternatively, we can use an inhibitor that inhibits this enzyme urease that converts the urea to ammonium. Either case, we're limiting or slowing the rate of ammonium release into the soil and therefore limiting the opportunity for ammonia loss. The other major place where we can use inhibitors is inhibiting the process of nitrification, which converts ammonium to nitrate. Nitrate is is a major source of nitrous oxide. It's part of denitrification, and we really want to. It's also the form of nitrogen that can be leached to groundwater. So we really want to minimize the accumulation of nitrate in our soils. So these nitrification inhibitors can be used to do that. Oftentimes you'll hear people using dual inhibitors that include both the inhibitor of urease and the inhibitor of nitrification to ensure that both steps are inhibited to even further slow that process and ensure that neither ammonium accumulates in being lost nor nitrate accumulates until the plant needs it. In some cases, a single inhibitor is sufficient, though. If we're using an ammonium-based source, there's no reason to put a urease inhibitor. It will have no impact. So a nitrification inhibitor alone would be sufficient. These products are available and can currently be used. The critical thing about realizing the advantage of using these inhibitors is because they result in increased nitrogen use efficiency, we should be using them at lower nitrogen rates to reflect that efficiency. And that kind of works out well because oftentimes these N sources are more expensive. Typically, they're around 15% more expensive, but they result in about a 30% increase in efficiency. So there's this opportunity to use 15 to 20% less of the source. So we're actually revenue neutral or saving us a bit of money and still getting the same plant yield because of that increased efficiency of nitrogen delivery. So therefore, I strongly suggest that if you are going to use an enhanced efficiency fertilizer, reduce the rate you're using it. Again, we've been doing some research in Atlantic Canada that I'll show you in a few moments, looking at the cost-neutral use of enhanced efficiency products. The other major thing that I think we need to think about is we need to realize that the soil supplies a lot of nitrogen through the process of nitrogen mineralization. The organic matter in the soil is transformed by bacteria and releases plant-available nitrogen. Indeed, about half the nitrogen a plant takes up comes from this source. And too often we've forgotten that in our calculations of how much nitrogen we need. In part, we've forgotten that because we have no effective way of measuring or estimating that number. And we've been working on ways of doing that. We've developed a test in Atlantic Canada where we can actually measure that biologically active nitrogen. We call it biological nitrogen availability, and look at its variability between fields. And here I've just shown you a variety of some of the 3,000 different fields we've sampled in Prince Edward Island and the range of growing season mineralization that we've detected. And it ranges from relatively low values of about 50 kilograms of N per hectare to extremely high values, over 300 kilograms of N per hectare. And the really important point to note is we're all treating these fields as if they were the same. We need to be able to tell the producer that, no, your field is up here, so you probably don't need very much, if any, fertilizer, whereas this producer probably needs to maybe even increase the rate of nitrogen they're using. But without this information, they can't adjust their nitrogen rate to take advantage of this end supply and increase the efficiency of use. So we're now working on a program where we actually will be able to generate maps of nitrogen mineralization potential for all of Canada so that we can provide producers a sense of how much nitrogen mineralization would you expect in your soil under your cropping system and under your management conditions. Does 4R work? I'm just going to very briefly show you a couple of examples of some of the work we've been doing potato production in Prince Edward Island. Here, over the last seven years, we've been doing a trial where we're comparing the grower's standard practice with a very straightforward 4R application. In this case, it's use of an enhanced efficiency fertilizer, or what we call 4R plus, where we've used that enhanced efficiency fertilizer at a reduced rate, at 20% reduction in nitrogen rate. And one of the things you can see is there's almost invariably, we had 1 year where that did not occur, but almost invariably there's a drop in the nitrous oxide emissions, particularly with the 4R, but even greater drop, as much as a 60% reduction when we also reduce the rate of the enhanced efficiency fertilizer. But what about yield? Absolutely no impact upon yields. So that enhanced efficiency product was able to supply the needs of that potato crop while reducing nitrous oxide emissions and reducing the potential for nitrate leaching. So that's an excellent example of how current technology can actually reduce these emissions. So to wind up, there are techniques that currently available to us in agriculture that can help us to contribute to a net zero agriculture. I've really only talked about nitrogen. Obviously, there's a carbon story that needs to be talked about. There's also some issues around the use of agricultural crops to produce biofuels, also increasing the biodiversity in cropping systems, all ways in which we can approach net zero. One of the things I really think is critical to this, though, and I haven't really talked very much about, but I want to mention it before I close, is that I think these environmental goods and services like reducing nitrous oxide emissions are additional value that is produced from your production system. And I think it's really essential that you get credit for that value and actually get paid for that environmental goods and services. And so one of the ways in which I think we can encourage the adoption of these practices is if there's some way in which you can recuperate the extra value that beyond your yield that this generating this environmental good and service represents, and that I think is really critical to the success of these sorts of programs and reaching net zero. Um, with that, I'm going to close with a brief highlight of a program that I've been involved in with Farmers for Climate Solutions. It's called the Farm Resilience Mentorship Program. It's a free training program, web-based training program that you can participate in simply by going to the farmlearninghub.ca and joining the program. It talks about a lot of the details of these various nitrogen management practices, and there's also a rotational grazing element and I'm forgetting what the third element was. I apologize, but I would really encourage you to check out this portal. I think it's a really excellent training resource, and again, it's free of charge. With that, I will stop sharing my slide.
Thank you very much, David. That's fantastic. Thanks for that. And Hushton, you go ahead and share your screen, and I'll just remind our remaining two presenters, please speak at a moderate pace for our interpreters. Thank you.
Is that our seamless transition there? So enteric emissions, when we talk enteric emissions, we're talking methane coming about from fermentation activity within the digestive tract of livestock. In Canada, that means mostly cattle, and it means mostly beef cattle. Slide to advance. This figure here is just an illustration of how much of a rapid acceleration in the amount of research and the number of publications that have come about on methane emissions when we've shifted from a focus on energy metabolism to a focus on environmental. And the relevance to the presentation today is that if we are having over 600 publications a year come out, roughly 2 a day, I'm only going to be able to cover the tops of some of the key points on it. It is not going to be a thorough, in-depth review of all of it. I do have 2 slides at the end with some key references in there for anyone wanting more information. They can look those up and find more there. We start with where our concern in this is, and carbohydrate metabolism is the basis of it. It's our major energy source, and glucose is the major monomer in there. And these chemical reactions, this is the typical one, glucose, oxygen, going towards carbon dioxide, water, and energy. If we go forward, it's cellular respiration. If we go reverse, it's photosynthesis. And it's just a reminder that all these reactions can run in reverse under the right conditions. We have 2 major polymers in our environment that supply this. One is starch, and we can use that because we have amylases to do that. And the other one is cellulose, and animals lack cellulase enzymes. We cannot make use of cellulose directly. We have a solution to that, which is to use enteric fermentation. We make use of microbial cellulases to degrade the cellulose to glucose. The microbes then convert the cellulose partway down the path towards carbon dioxide and water. We limit their access to oxygen so it doesn't go all the way. They get some energy from that, support their growth. We are able to take those end products produced by the microbes, take them the rest of the way, and get the energy from that. There are 4 main groups of rumen microbes responsible for this: the bacteria, the fungi, the protozoa, and the archaea. And the archaea are of particular importance to the conversation today because they're the methanogens. I got a nice little picture here of what a protozoa looks like, and the little white lines and spots you see on it over the body, not at the end, are examples of relative size differences between bacteria and protozoa. This fermentation process is multi-species involved, and they have different steps within it, and interspecies transfer there. And it's basically different levels in the food chain. The first level that we're talking about is polymer hydrolysis. So that's taking our cellulose, our starch, into the monomer of glucose. This is extracellular. It occurs outside the cells of the microbes. Then we see the fermentation of those monomers to volatile fatty acids. There's a production of hydrogen. If there's any oxygen present, it's being used to produce carbon dioxide, and then a variety of intermediates. And then we get a tertiary level where the intermediates are fermented towards volatile fatty acids. And we also have methanogenesis occurring using carbon dioxide available within the rumen and hydrogen produced by fermentation to produce methane and provide energy for the archaea that are producing that methane. And a key point here is this enzyme, methyl coenzyme M reductase, MCR. It is highly conserved and it catalyzes the final step in methane production. Just to give an example of what the pathways look like, we start here on the left with our structural carbohydrates of cellulose, or our non-structural ones of starch. Going to simple sugars, this is our first trophic level. Those simple sugars are then fermented to a variety of intermediates. That's our second trophic level. And then our third one takes those intermediates onto our main volatile fatty acids of acetate, butyrate, or propionate. And the key point to keep track of here is that it's the production of acetate and butyrate that are also linked with the production of methane. So going towards propionate, no methane associated. Going towards acetate, butyrate, to a large extent, methane is associated with those ones. That gives us our background for how we go about mitigating methane emissions. We have 3 different levels to this. The first one is what we refer to as a direct intervention, and it is where we are specifically targeting the methanogens, or the archaea, or that specific enzyme that is always all possessed by them, the MCR, methyl coenzyme M reductase. The second level we can look at is we don't directly target the methanogens or their enzymes, but we manipulate the rumen environment to affect the microbes that support them. Because the methanogens are a 3rd level food chain one, if we can disrupt the first 2 levels in some fashion, that can affect the methanogens. The alternate way to do that is to provide an alternate hydrogen sink. If we can deny hydrogen to the methanogens, they don't have the substrate they need to produce methane. And then the third path we have is the focus on livestock production. It really has very little to do with any direct efforts on methane reduction, but we're looking at reducing the methane production intensity. And if we do that and keep overall production the same, then the absolute emissions should be reduced. Overall production rises, it's still possible that those emissions could rise. Our first example of a direct intervention strategy is 3-NOP, 3-nitrooxypropanol, Bovaer. It's licensed, I believe, in Argentina and Chile. It just became approved for use in the UK. Apparently the news on that came out yesterday and it just came across my email this morning. And the mode of action is that this nitrogen group here will bind in the active site of the MCR enzyme and deactivate it. The effect is dose dependent, and we usually get about a 20 to 40% reduction at the doses that they're using. This molecule is then degraded in the rumen to nitrate and to 1,3-propanediol, so they're splitting the bond at this point. The effect is diet dependent. Generally speaking, the level of mitigation is higher with a high concentrate diet and declines as the forage inclusion in the diet increases. There can be some concern with fiber digestion and intake. By blocking the production of methane, we can have some accumulation of hydrogen within the rumen, and that plugs up that whole enzymatic pathway and could slow down the degradation of fiber by the other microbes. And when fiber is impaired, then intake can be impaired. This is really only concerned with really high doses, not the level of doses that they're looking to imply to get to this level of reduction. So most of these ones, there will be a dose-dependent one. Because this is broken down in the rumen, we need to have a fairly consistent and precise intake of this within the rumen, and that means it's mostly constrained to situations where we're feeding a TMR. It can be mixed into the diet. That gives us accurate dosing, and it gives us consistent dosing throughout the day as cattle or other livestock consume feed. Right now, this is under review by CFIA, so it's not an option right now. When they complete their review, assuming that they approve it, it could be ready to use in the very near future. A second direct intervention strategy. This is Asparagopsis taxiformis. It is an example of a red seaweed. I've got my own picture here of red seaweed. This is not Asparagopsis. It's a different one. This one doesn't work as well, but it shows what the material looks like. The reason for the difference in efficacy has to do with the level of halogenated methane analogs present in the seaweeds. The most common one that we talk about with seaweeds is bromoforms, and it's basically taking a methane molecule, the CH4, and replacing some of the H's with predominantly chlorine or bromine, could also be fluoride or iodine, and that allows those molecules to bind to MCR and block its activity. It is dose and variety dependent, and you can get profound reductions in methane emissions with this. Some trials have reported emissions reductions of up to 98%. The problem is that a lot of the halogenated methane analogs are either toxic or carcinogenic. And we have, so there's a public perception issue, both real and perceived, but we also have inclusion limits related to the sulfur content of the seaweeds. Some of the carbohydrates have sulfur substituted groups in there, and the iodine contents in there. So that puts limits on how much we can include in the diet. If it's not included in a TMR, then we can have issues with palatability. This is one of the problems we had when we tried to use this variety in a cattle feeding trial. The cattle looked at it and says, I've got green grass in the pasture, and this is strange. I don't want to eat it. Had we been able to roll it into the green grass, perhaps less of an issue. Some of the seaweeds are CFIA approved. The one we attempted to use was. Not all are effective. If you're looking to which ones you can use, check the CFIA approved feed list and check to see if they have halogenated methane analog levels within them. And indirect ones. This is not targeting the methanogens directly. This is targeting the other microbes or providing a hydrogen sink, is the use of nitrate. The commercial product here is Silvair. It's a calcium nitrate compound. We provide that nitrate to the rumen. The rumen microbes convert that to nitrate, then to ammonia, and then they use that to synthesize microbial crude protein. This is all a good thing. The effect is very much dose dependent, about 12.5% reduction per 1% nitrate added to the diet. The problem for anyone that's fed cattle that knows, high nitrate levels are toxic because when it gets converted from nitrate to nitrite, nitrite can bind with the hemoglobin in the blood and impair the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Turns the blood a nice chocolatey color, and then the animals asphyxiate. So we need to either have slower release forms to reduce the risk of that toxicity. So this goes back to our previous presentation. And we need to worry about diet-dependent inclusion limits. So generally speaking, we want less than 2% in the diet for an added impact there, which means it's going to have an impact at about 20% reduction, but it's going to depend on what nitrates are already present in those diets. We need consistent, precise intake. So again, we're talking TMR type feeding systems. This is more costly than urea, but the fact that you can replace urea with this means that part of the cost of buying nitrate sources is offset. Another indirect one, monensin, it's an ionophore antibiotic, most commonly known as rumensin. It has an impact by reducing intake, and methane emissions are very much related to intake level. It selects against gram-positive bacteria, and by selecting against gram-positive bacteria, it shifts fermentation from acetate to propionate. And it was the acetate that was associated with methane production and propionate that wasn't. So that's the reduction there. There can be an improvement in feed efficiency. When they've looked at this for methane reduction, the effect is generally small, about 5%. And in some studies, it's been temporary because other bacteria have stepped in to fill those same metabolic pathways, and it's the metabolic pathway that matters, not the specific bacteria. We need a fairly consistent, precise intake with this, or a TMR, or there's an option for an intraruminal slow release device. So essentially a rumen bolus with wings so the cattle can't regurgitate it, a spring in the back end to push the dose up against the front end, and the release is from this front end, and that is somewhat metered by how it's designed. This could be used for some of the other options out there too, like the 3-nope. I don't know if that's been developed yet or not, but then would mean having to reapply boluses to your livestock on a regular basis. The downside to this is monensin is already in widespread use, and if you're using monensin in the future isn't reducing your emissions from where you are now. Plant secondary compounds is yet another indirect source, and there is a host of these compounds. The three main categories for them are essential oils, so aromatic compounds and blends. They're used as flavoring agents. And you can see here the types of things we're talking about: cinnamon, oregano, etc. Saponins, these are natural detergents or soaps, and yucca extracts are an example there. And then tannins, which are phenyl-rich compounds that bind proteins. And we usually talk here about forages that have high tannin contents, but there is a commercial available version, Silvafeed. Tannins can be anti-nutritional, depending on whether we want to shift protein degradation from the rumen to the intestine or back. All of these could have an impact on intake. The presumed mode of action is by reducing the protozoa and subsequently methanogens. They do generally shift fermentation from acetate to propionate. The effects tend to be variable, meaning they're somewhat modest, and they can be transient. A lot of these compounds can be relatively costly, and the practical application is mostly directed at things like getting these natural forages with high tannin contents into the diet, or if they have higher essential oil compounds in there. The issue there is not only are the effects transient, but the available tannins, the available essential oils vary with the stage of growth, and the essential oils themselves can be oxidized. So it can be a limited time application that's available with them. Edible oils and fatty acids. This is predominantly an indirect one. We're talking here about things like canola, flax, and sunflower. There's a twofold impact on these ones. A certain level of antimicrobial effect where the fatty acids select against some of the rumen microbes, but also when you're dealing with unsaturated fat sources, the rumen microbes tend to saturate those fats and it acts as a hydrogen sink. Most of the effect is assumed to be related to the antimicrobial impact. The hydrogen sink is a small component. The effect's variable, usually about 20 to 30%, very much dependent on the fat level and the fat type. It is more effective with shorter chain fatty acids and more unsaturated fats. They need to be rumen active and available. So if we're doing something like the calcium soap that can be encapsulated for dairy cattle supplementation with Megalac, that tends to have not much effect there. If we're feeding purified flax oil, that can have an effect, but it can be expensive. So the option of using byproducts as a way to get there is that. There's a nice little image here of some corn distillers grains, which can have a moderately high fat content and be a contribution there. There's inclusion limits of about 4 to 6% added fat. Depending on which nutritionist you talk to, they will have different recommendations. Depending on which fat it is, the recommendations should be different. If you exceed those levels, you will see impaired fiber degradation, and that will lead to reduced intake. Livestock cattle are generally not adapted to do well on high fat diets. So we're only talking about limited levels of supplementation here. There is the potential you can alter product quality. In some cases, this can be good, producing omega-3 enriched beef or dairy products, whether or not you get a label for it. In other cases, that might not be so good. For example, if you go to have your omega-3 enriched steak and you find out it tastes like fish, and you were not looking for the taste of fish when you eat your steak. So that is a consumer preference concern there, positive or negative, depending on how you go about it. Feed quality. This is an indirect one that starts going towards the animal production side of it. In this case, we're assuming that we're going to keep livestock production about the same. We're talking about things like concentrate to forage ratio, digestibility, processing levels. Generally speaking, the more sugar or starch we put into the diet, the more rapidly degradable the feeds are, the more of a shift in the rumen microbial populations and the fermentation pathways they follow, and it goes towards lower acetate to propionate. And that lower acetate propionate is the reason why methane emissions decline. There's also the potential to lower rumen pH, which leads to reduced protozoal populations. And the protozoa are one of the main supports for the methanogens, to the point that quite often do we not only see methanogens living on the protozoa to be close to the release of hydrogen, we'll see methanogens actually living within the protozoa and absorbing the hydrogen even before it leaves that protozoa. As an example of the level of impact we have here, our tier 2 recommendations are for very high quality, high grain content diets. Methane emissions are going to make up about 2% of the gross energy of the feed that the animals consume. On the other extreme, very low quality diets, things like a very high straw diet, the gross energy, it might have as much as 12% of that going towards methane. And because those are both high carbohydrate feeds, the gross energy values are very much the same. What we see more commonly is a 3 to 7% range in terms of the amount of gross energy being directed towards methane. So potentially a 50% decrease, but depends on where you start. And it depends on how well you can accommodate a change in feed quality within your production system. There's a reason why we don't have dairy cattle on feedlot finishing diets. For the livestock production side, we can talk about genetics. Generally speaking, selecting more productive, efficient livestock. Residual feed intake selection is a recognized approach. We can talk about heterosis and hybrid vigor. So there's a genetic test there for that as well. And specifically, there's been a CEMEX EPD released for methane emissions from dairy cattle. And there's a link towards that. Nutrition, very much a case of intake and diet composition are driving methane production. So anything we're doing in terms of grazing plans, balancing nutrient supplies, improving production, improving efficiency, has the ability to reduce methane emissions. And the nutritional models that are available now are starting to include estimates of methane production there. So you can simulate what your changes are in advance of feeding your cattle. In this case, as simple as having a mineral feeder out there can improve your production and dilute the methane emissions there. Health impacts, big one here as well, and a host of opportunities. Everything from preventing diseases, managing parasites, avoiding stress, keeping a cleaner pen surface so your animals are not as stressed by wading through mud and manure. The general impact is to improve feed efficiency, keep animals productive, and improve reproductive outcomes. The analogy here is if you compare your livestock to a vehicle, you do not want to have your vehicle idling. It's not good for fuel efficiency. If the vehicle is running, you want it to be driving. The point on this is that livestock production efficiencies are responsible for most of the reductions to date. The Canadian Cattle Association has indicated that we've reduced the methane emissions of beef cattle production intensity by about 15% over the last 30 years. All of those reductions are a result of pursuing production efficiency. The potential for this is greatest in least productive systems. And in the absence of some sort of carbon credit trading or other incentive, it's the production improvements themselves that are going to provide the return to offset the cost of the improvements. And that's why those are the ones that have been taking place now. There is increased interest in putting forth some sort of a credit system for it. Environment and Climate Change Canada has come up with a draft protocol for reducing methane emissions for beef cattle. It's open for comments until the 6th of February. The link for that is at the end of this with the references. There's a host of other topics related to this that I have not covered. Time is limited. They're still important. I thought it was important to indicate what they are. Some of these are covered within the references as well. And with that, I believe I am out of time and need to leave this go towards Andrew. And just to show, yes, we have the references there. Thank you.
Thank you, Hushton. Very good. And I'll invite Andrew to share his screen and proceed with his presentation. Thanks again, Hushton.
All right. Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here, and I'm going to talk about manure emissions, which kind of fit in between the animal and the land, which we've heard about previously. And the first point that I want to get across here is that when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions from manure, there's three important gases to consider. So there's methane, nitrous oxide, both of which we've heard about earlier. So those can both be emitted, as well as ammonia, which is not itself a greenhouse gas, but because it's emitted in fairly large quantities and when it's deposited elsewhere in the environment, it contributes indirectly to nitrous oxide emissions. Now, in a liquid manure system, which is I've shown on the left here, because it's anaerobic conditions, the primary greenhouse gas is going to be methane. And if we look at the overall budget of greenhouse gases, even accounting for the different global warming potentials between methane and nitrous oxide, methane will be still at least 90% of the total budget for a liquid manure system. And there's going to be generally a higher amount of greenhouse gas emissions per unit of manure or per animal unit from a liquid system. In solid manure systems, because there's a mixture of aerobic and anaerobic conditions within a pile, there's going to be nitrous oxide, there's going to be methane, and there's also going to be ammonia. And those three gases will all contribute to the overall greenhouse gas budget. So each of these gases has different processes that lead to it being emitted. Methane on the left in a manure system is fairly simple or straightforward process. The difference, one of the main differences, is that because these the microorganisms are in an uncontrolled, well, basically an ambient environment, the temperature is changing through the year. And so the amount of activity, the amount of methanogenesis will vary through the year. And so the graph there on the left is showing the monthly total methane emissions that we measured from a dairy manure storage tank near Ottawa. And what you can see is through the winter, even through the spring into June, there's no methane being produced. Then in July, August, it starts to increase. The peak amount of methane emissions is in September. And then there's still high emissions in October and in November. So the amount of emissions changes through the year. The advantage is that the emissions are not occurring through the whole year. They're really focused in the period of time when there's manure in storage and the temperature of the manure is warm enough for methanogenesis to be quite active. Ammonia emissions in the middle is essentially a chemical equilibrium and a chemical process that is driven by, really strongly influenced by the pH of the manure. So at a lower pH, the equilibrium between the gaseous form of ammonia and the aqueous form of ammonia that's dissolved in the liquid will be more towards the aqueous side. And at a higher pH, it'll be more toward the gaseous side. So there will be more loss of ammonia at a higher pH than a lower pH. The wind speed, the temperature are also important driving factors. But I think methane and ammonia are fairly straightforward processes that can be understood and mitigated. Nitrous oxide, because manure has so much nitrogen in it and carbon, and there's lots of interactions between temperature, moisture, freezing and thawing, it's more challenging to mitigate nitrous oxide. But I'll talk about all of these going forward. But first, I want to put some context on what the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions are and how these different gases contribute. This is according to the national estimates from Environment Canada. And the pie chart in the top left shows the total emissions from the dairy and swine sectors, which have primarily liquid manure systems. That's 89% methane is what's contributing to that. And so those emissions, whereas in the bottom left, the beef and poultry sectors, which have more solid manure, 71% nitrous oxide, and then about a third of methane. And then if we add in the indirect emissions, we get the pie chart on the right, about 7,800 kilotons of CO2 equivalents. But 68% of that is methane, and the indirect contribution, indirect N2O from ammonia loss as well as nitrate leaching. So that gives a sense of how these different gases contribute overall. Now into some of the mitigation strategies, and I'll focus on liquid manure systems first. Of course, in a way, the ideal mitigation strategy is biogas systems or anaerobic digestion. In this case, the concept is to capture the methane and in fact build a reactor that's going to optimize the temperature and the other conditions required so that the methanogens can produce as much methane as possible from the substrate, from the manure, and then collect that methane, upgrade it to a pipeline quality, for example, or clean it and use it for producing electricity and heat and things like that. So not only is it then going to, what comes out of the digester, which is the digestate, which goes into a storage, that digestate will have less methane potential than the manure that was there before in a liquid manure system. But also you'll then have the use of the biogas. It's kind of a win-win in that sense. Of course, the downside is there's a high capital cost, and now there's the requirement to manage the biogas system through the whole year, whereas in the past, the methane emissions were only occurring for part of the year. So it's not the solution for everyone, but it is an approach that can reduce emissions and also produce a usable product. A similar kind of related tactic is to cover the storage. One approach to that on the left is an active cover system. So what I mean by that is this is a floating cover that's impermeable. The biogas is going to collect underneath there. It's going to move towards a series of pipes. The pipes are going to take the biogas and pass it through a flare. The flare will convert methane into CO2. Or it can go into a biofilter that's engineered so that the methane will be oxidized microbially into CO2. It's not an inexpensive system by any means, and any rain and whatnot, the snow and ice that lands on top has to be managed. So there's challenges with that in many places in Canada. On the right, more of a passive approach is looks kind of like a tent, and this will prevent water from getting into the tank, which has its own benefits, but also it will prevent the wind from moving over the surface. It will prevent ammonia emissions. It will keep that nitrogen in the manure, but it will not stop methane from being produced, and it will not stop methane from being emitted. So in fact, methane might actually be produced more if that cover creates kind of a greenhouse effect and makes the manure temperature higher, but good for preventing ammonia loss. Floating covers is another approach, that permeable covers, I should say. That this is a study that I did as part of my PhD, and what we looked at was straw covers, which basically chopped straw blown onto the surface of manure, the controlled manure on the left, with nothing on the surface. And then in another study, what's shown on the right is a floating geotextile membrane, and it's only 2 centimeters thick. So the straw is up to 30 centimeters thick, and the geotextile is 2 centimeters thick with a layer of recycled foam underneath. And essentially what we found is both of these cover systems are very effective at preventing ammonia loss. So better than 90% reduction of ammonia emissions. So that's going to keep more nitrogen in the manure. But the geotextile did not reduce methane emissions at all, whereas the straw cover, they did. And you can think of it kind of like a floating biofilter. So as the methane is produced in the manure and it reaches the surface, it doesn't take long for it to pass through 2 centimeters of geotextile. So there's not enough time for microbial methane oxidation to occur. But in the straw, because it was 30 centimeters thick, there's more time, more retention time in that layer, and more opportunity for microbial oxidation. The downside is that there's also now an environment on the surface where nitrous oxide can be produced. So there's more nitrous oxide emissions in the straw covered system, which offset part of the methane emission reductions. So a 25% reduction of methane emissions offset by the increased nitrous oxide results in a 20% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions over the course of a year. And that's with full and continuous coverage with that straw cover during the full summer and fall. A different option, I guess, is what I'm showing here. Just relates to the timing when manure is applied in the field and how that relates to how long the manure is in storage. So in this case, this is 2 years where we measured emissions at a dairy farm. And the graph on the left I've already shown earlier. Essentially, you could see the emissions increasing in July and August and then decreasing in October and November. And then the manure is pumped out in November. And taking the area under the curve, we get 42 tons of methane that was emitted from that tank over that year. And then the next year, they applied the manure to the fields in September rather than in November. And what happens then is there's lower average emissions for the month of September. There's no emissions in October and November. So over the course of the year, integrating under the curve, we get 33 tons of methane that year because there was less manure in storage though the manure was in storage for less time. So a 21% reduction for the year. Similar effects we've seen from in-season application like side dressing manure into corn. So again, there's less manure in storage during the warm season and therefore less carbon available to be converted into methane. A different approach, more mechanical in nature, is solid liquid separation. On the left, a screw press, which extracts the fiber out of dairy manure. So this results in less carbon being in the liquid fraction that goes into the manure tank. That fiber fractions then composted and used for bedding. And what the graph shows is a 27% decrease in methane production from the liquid fraction compared to the manure when it wasn't passed through the screw press. So less carbon in storage, less methane production. Taking that a step further, we did a study at a dairy farm that has a nutrient recovery system, which takes that screw pressed liquid and then passes it through a system with flocculant to take out the fine solids as well. So that also ends up in a solid, handled as a solid manure type of system. And that essentially eliminated methane production in the liquid fraction. A different tactic that takes advantage of the idea that methanogens are very sensitive to temperature. Just in the graph in the top right, showing some lab results from the same manure incubated in bottles at different temperatures, 18 degrees, 21 degrees, and 23 degrees. And just looking at that dashed horizontal line, which it's just the same amount of methane to be produced at 18 degrees took 3.5 months, at 21 degrees, 2 months, at 23 degrees, 5 weeks. So the implication is, because the warm season in Canada is not very long, if the peak temperature in the summer could be reduced by a couple of degrees, then that's going to delay the methane production, and then it'll reduce the overall annual emissions. And one approach to that is having a roof over the manure storage, and it's different than the tent that I was showing earlier. This roof also has open sides so that the wind can blow through, and based on a modeling study that we did, that will result in lower temperature in the manure by a couple of degrees at least in the summertime, which would reduce the methane production over the summer. In some farms where the manure is stored under the barn and then transferred outside, there's an opportunity at some times of the year to reduce the average temperature that the manure is exposed to by transferring it from the barn outside as fast as possible. So rather than keeping it under the barn where it's warmer for a week or two before transferring it outside, transfer it outside right away, and then there will be less time for methane to be produced because it's colder outside. Additives are another thing that we've done research on, and the most effective one is adding a single dose of a small amount of sulfuric acid. So this picture on the left shows a dairy manure in an experimental tank. So that's about 10,000 liters of manure. And you can see all the bubbles, which indicate methane and CO2 being produced. The tank on the right is an example of a tank where on one day in July, sulfuric acid was added to decrease the pH by half of a pH unit. So that's making the pH a bit less hospitable for what the methanogens prefer. And it's also adding sulfate, which has an inhibitory effect on methanogens. And what you see in the picture is that there's no bubbles. And what you can see in the graph is that in the green part on the top, the green line indicates the methane production is quite high in the control during the summer and through the fall. But in the treated tanks, there's no production of methane through the summer and fall. And the net effect over the course of the year was at least an 86% reduction of methane production and at least a 40% reduction of ammonia loss, because lower pH moves that equilibrium of ammonia to retain more of it. So that was so far the most effective way of reducing methane and ammonia at the same time. And just to note that in Denmark, there are systems in place on farms doing this type of acidification continuous process. And there's been on-farm applications of this approach of doing it one dose in the early summer to prevent the methane from being produced just in the warm period. Moving over to solid manure, I've looked at a meta-analysis of 50 studies by Pardo and colleagues. And because there's multiple gases that are important in the solid manure systems, it's harder to get a win-win that really does everything. But the only approach that was effective statistically at reducing nitrous oxide emissions in solid manure management was to improve the structure of the manure pile, increasing the porosity by adding bulking agents like straw or wood chips. And this effectively reduces the number of anaerobic microsites within the pile, improves the airflow through the pile, and decreased N2O by more than 50%, decreased methane by more than 70%. On the other hand, because it makes sense that if there's more airflow through the pile, there's going to be more ammonia loss. And indeed, 50% increase of ammonia emissions were noted with that approach. Composting is another approach that can reduce methane emissions statistically by at least 70% compared to static pile, as long as there's at least monthly turning to prevent stratification and anaerobic pockets developing in the pile. Nitrous oxide was also reduced on average by 60%, although the statistical confidence was lower for N2O. And again, because there's more turning, more contact with the air, it makes sense that ammonia emissions were found to be increased by 50%. So again, there's a trade-off. One way that's very effective for reducing ammonia loss, so retaining more nitrogen, is covering the piles. And in this study, with this well-covered pile, there was 90% lower ammonia emissions. But that coverage did not result in a change in N2O, at least not a consistent one, and did not result in a change in methane emissions either. So not really not really effective for the main greenhouse gases, but retains more nitrogen. Quite a few additives have been tested with solid manure management as well: phosphogypsum, ferric chloride, alum, a number of different chemicals, as well as some absorbent materials like zeolite and other clay. And generally, in this meta-analysis, which looked at all of those together, the additives reduced methane and ammonia emissions, and on average reduced N2O, although it was not statistically significant. So there's some promise in the additive sphere, but not enough study on any particular additive to be confident in recommending which one at this point in time. And just I wanted to touch on application briefly with just one slide, which is just this one, to say that in terms of the different ways of applying manure, especially liquid manure to the land, broadcasting liquid manure and leaving it on the surface depends on the temperature and the soil, of course, but I did some model simulations here, and it's certainly possible to lose 45% of the ammonia nitrogen by leaving it on the surface. Broadcasting and then incorporating within 24 hours is going to reduce those losses to maybe 40% less loss. Applying it directly on the surface with a trailing hose is better, in broadcasting and incorporating immediately within a few minutes is much better. And injecting, of course, is going to almost eliminate the losses. So just thinking about keeping as much of the nitrogen that's there so that it can be used by the crop. And I just put all of the things I've talked about together on this summary table. And I just wanted to I think, leave with the point that that manure storages are a significant point source of emissions, but I think there's a number of practices and technologies that are available to make significant emission reductions in the short term. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. And thanks to all our presenters. Those were excellent presentations.